Good morning, everybody. So we're back again today. This time we have a video that I think would benefit the community. It's going to be a deck building 101 video, which is going to include ratios for you newer players who are maybe building your first deck, or maybe you're just finding cards at your local Target and you want to get into the game. Great. You don't know how to build a deck? You've come to the right place. I'm going to give you some ratios to help you get started. And if you already know how to build a deck, then we're going to go over some key things to consider while you're building your own decks so that maybe you don't run into some problems where you're bricking or you're not quite as consistent or your deck isn't performing as powerfully as it needs to. So we're going to go over all of that and more for you here today. So if you like what you see, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and let's go ahead and get right into the video. So the first thing you want to consider when you're building a deck is, what's my strategy? Now, this sounds like a basic question, but too many times when I'm in the Facebook group, I see people that share their deck list, and it's just very scattered. Like, it's all over the place. It's focusing on like 4 different ideas, and there's support for maybe 2 of them. So what you need to do is you need to pick a strategy, stick with it, and focus on making that strategy as powerful and as consistent as possible. So, a couple of questions to keep in mind when you're doing that. Whenever you're building your deck, make sure you're staying on focus. When you're putting cards in, ask if this helps my overall strategy or if this helps against the matchups that I'm weak against. If the answer is no to both of those questions, it probably shouldn't be included in your deck. So the goal is to have as few cards as possible that are just going to be sitting in your hand dead for most of the game. You know, unless it's like a Gaia Force or something where you need to have it in your hand and you wait for the powerful moment where you play the card. That's fine and dandy. But if every card in your deck fills that purpose where it's sitting in your hand until it's useful, you're just going to be running into a lot of situations where you can't progress your game state. And when you're not progressing your game state and your opponent is progressing their game state, you're going to lose. That's how the game works. So another thing to consider would be how your deck matches up with the current meta. So if I'm playing Blue Omni, for instance, I know that my weakest matchup is going to be Red Omni because of the amount of removal they have. So maybe when I'm building my deck, I keep that matchup in the back of my mind. You know, if I put a card into my deck and I say, this makes my matchup against Red Omni worse, I probably shouldn't include it. Things like Cocytus Breath are cards that I see blue teching to help with that matchup because it gets an Omni off the board. And, you know, that's fine. If you have a specific card in mind to help you deal with that matchup, maybe include it, especially if that deck is going to be seen a lot at your local tournament scene. So the last question I want to consider on this slide would be how to stay as consistent as possible. So one way you can do that is to stick to the guideline ratios that we're going to be giving later in the video. So we're going to have ratios for basically any kind of deck you could want to build in this card game. And you want to when taking consistency into consideration, you want to, again, consider how many cards are sitting dead in your hand, but you also want to consider how your cards are filtering into each other. For instance, you know, you see a lot of people playing like Groundramon or the Monzemon, not only because they have a cheap evolution cost, but because they're cheap to play. So if they're in a situation where they're stuck waiting on a champion, waiting on a rookie, you know, hard playing the Monzemon, hard playing the Groundramon isn't the worst play in the world because you can evolve it into a Mega on the next turn. So you want to vary your costs. You want to make sure that you're including cards in your deck that help you draw, that help you search for what you need. There isn't really that many ways to search for cards in the Digimon TCG now. So filtering out cards as fast as possible, making sure you're holding on to as many cards in your hand as you can, and you're always looking for that +1, that's how you're going to keep consistency in the decks. And so whenever you're building your decks, you should definitely consider options that help you filter. And if you're playing a deck that is maybe less consistent than others, like some of the tamer-oriented decks like Shine Greymon or Old First Featuremon, maybe you need to play more cards that help you draw or more cards that help you filter. Just something to keep in mind. So, in this slide, what we're going to do is we're going to compare consistency in deck building versus power in deck building. So, if you stick to the standard ratios that we're going to be given later in the deck, then you're going to have or later in this video, you're going to have a very consistent deck. You're usually going to have the levels that you need. You're not going to be locked out of anything. And you're going to find ways to draw cards and make sure that you minimize the odds of you having dead cards in your hand. However, if your deck isn't as powerful as some of the other decks, take Diaboromon, for instance. It's a very, very powerful strategy, but it loses out to Omnimon. If you're playing a card like that, sure, you have a weaker matchup against the most dominant deck in the meta, and you should expect to lose 50% of the games that you go into a tournament and play. But the other 50% of the games, Diaboromon's a very powerful card. It blows other decks out of the water because they can't deal with the speed that Diaboromon puts tokens on in play. And that's one thing, consistency versus power, you know. You have this really powerful card, but it's not very consistent. You know, you could load your deck with cards like Puppetmon. You could load your deck with cards like Volcanic Dramon, Metal Sea Dramon, all these powerful cards. You could play more Megas. You could play more Ultimates and have a grindier game where you have a high... If your opponent deals with one of your Megas, you just play another one. And since you're playing so many, you have more powerful options to go into and a wider variety of powerful options. The thing is that hurts your consistency because you're missing out on some of your lower levels. You're missing out on some of your Digivolutions. You're missing out on some of the cards that let you draw, that let you filter. So it's one thing to consider. If you get your powerful options when you need them, and you hold them, and you can put yourself in the driver's seat, yeah, you're going to be a more powerful deck than any other deck in the format. But you aren't going to do that 100% of the time. Even the most consistent deck dead draws sometimes. And when you're playing a deck and you're putting more powerful cards in your deck versus more consistent cards, and you lean heavily towards one or the other, you're going to see that in an outcome whenever you start playing games and tournaments. So it's something to consider. You can play all of these gimmicky cards, and you can go for all of these very high risk, very high reward strategies. And, you know, it is just that. It's risk versus reward. So you have to consider these cards whenever you're including them into the deck. If you include more cards in your deck that let you draw more and let you get more memory, then you have more room to play some of these powerful cards that will help you swing games in your favor. And I would consider all of these techs. What you want to do is you really, really want to consider how many of these cards you should be including into your deck whenever you're building. What you have room for, how well does your deck filter out cards, and how am I going to be able to get these powerful options off, put me in the driver's seat, and keep the advantage. So, consistency versus power. If you want a really good example of this, you can look at my wife's Dimension Scissor control deck. She plays a lot of Ultimates, a lot of Megas, but she only plays 12 Rookies. And very high option in Tamer count. So it's one of those things that I just get rolled by that deck sometimes, because sometimes she just draws absolutely amazing. Sometimes she'll open the Rookies, she'll open the Champion, she'll get the Chain Up, she'll get the Izzy early game, she'll start drawing cards, and I'll just get absolutely rolled because I can't deal with Rosemon plus Herc plus 3 Puppets plus Titamon plus double Dimension Scissor. She plays a lot of powerful cards, but it isn't the most consistent deck. So That's the perfect example right there. So we're getting into some ratios here. So all of you newer players, this is probably the part of the video that you were waiting for. And it's, how many of each card should I include whenever I'm building my own deck? So the first sort of set of ratios I'm going to give you is for what I would call a standard deck. So we have things like basic purple, like Piedmon. We have your standard red Gallantmon deck. You have your yellow DP reduction deck. Basically, you pick a level 6, you want to build a deck around it. You can do that because there's a lot of powerful level 6s in this game. So these are just a few options I have on the screen. You can go like Rust Tyrannomon even. But starting off, you want typically 14 to 16 level 3s. This is so that you always have a card to play on top of your Digitama turn 1 so that you get your draw. I usually like 11 to 13 level 4s. I think 12 is the magic number for this. I think 12 is the perfect amount of level 4s unless you want something specific. 7 to 10 level 5s. I typically hover around 9 myself. And then 4 to 8 level 6s, depending on what kind of deck you want, how many copies of the level 6 that you're building around, and what other options you want in the deck. And then 0 to 6 tamers and options. So this is where I see a lot of newer players struggle. A lot of newer players will want to include a lot of tamers and a lot of options in the deck, and that's absolutely fine if you're playing something like Lilithmon. However, most decks, putting too many options and too many tamers in will hurt your consistency, because by making room for all of these cards, you're missing out on a bunch of the other levels in the deck. So you'll see that whenever we go to this next slide, but when you muddy it down with just cards that aren't Digimon, you are reducing your chance of having a body that replaces itself, which makes it harder to keep the advantage. So tamers and options you typically want to use to either set your memory or have as just removal cards. So, and if you're having a removal card, then it's taking care of one of their bodies in play, which ultimately will get you back the advantage. So decks like these, standard decks, typically have room for a few tech cards. You'll typically see decks like Gallantmon, even some Leopardmon decks play cards like Puppet, play cards like Volcanic Dramon. And it's because they have the room for a few. Again, you don't want to bog your deck down with too many, because while you might make your deck more powerful, you'll hurt your consistency. So it's just something to consider. But this is what I consider to be standard ratios for your average deck in the Digimon TCG. So what we have next is going to be your level 7 base deck. So Omnimon right now. Set 1.5, we have Ragnalordmon. So we have Chaosmon Valderarm coming out. And we have a bunch of level 7s in the game that are very easy to make a deck around because they're just very powerful cards. So this is going to be your ratios for that. You typically want between 13 to 15 level 3s. And this number right here is going to depend on the on-play cost of your level 4s. So if you're playing like a Millenniummon deck, you can get away with playing less level 3s if you're going with the black route, because you have Numamon, which costs the same as a level 3. So you can start your chain at a level 4 by just hard playing him and kind of skip a level there. So most typically tend to hover around 14. That's typically the magic number for rookies. If you're playing any less, then you don't guarantee that you're drawing one on your opening hand. And then you have 11 to 12 level 4s, 7 to 10 level 5s, 4 to 7 level 6s, 3 to 6 level 7s, and then as few options and tamers as possible, realistically. If you're playing blue, you gotta include 4 Hammerspark. If you're playing red, you gotta include 4 Gaia Force, but typically blue Omnimon decks won't play any tamers. Red Omnimon decks might play 1. So you want to include as few as possible, because again, you're adding an extra level to this deck. So you can't cut too many of your level 3s. You can't cut too many of your level 4s to make room for these options and tamers, because you have to add an entire other level here. So these kind of decks typically have less consistency than your standard deck, but they typically have more power because level 7s in and of themselves are stronger Digimon because they're the next level up. But you have room for no tech cards in decks like this because your space is tight. You have to include these level 7 cards. You have to make room so that you have enough of all of the other cards that you can consistently drop these level 7s, because without them you aren't winning the game. But these are your ratios for the level 7 base deck. Now what we have next is going to be a deck that is typically not playable until 1.5, just because these archetypes that revolve around tamers come out then. But tamer-based decks will definitely be a thing in the future, and it's something that you got to look out for. Now, I think these are some of the least consistent decks in the Digimon TCG, because if you look down and you see that I have 7 to 11 tamers and options, you have to make cuts somewhere in your list. You have to cut rookies, you have to cut champions, so that you can make room for these options and tamers, and that hurts your overall consistency. So your tamers and options that you include better be very good ones, and they better be included for a very good reason. But with these cards, they win games on their own. You know, Shine Greymon is basically a board wipe. Ulforce Vidramon, when you set it up right, can attack like a gajillion times. So it's one of those things that these decks can win, and they're very powerful. They just have to play so many draw and so many filter cards, and they have to get the right setup in order to do it. But make no mistake, Shine Greymon is going to be a tier 1 deck, and it is going to be a tamer-based deck. So even with the hurt to consistency, Shine Greymon is powerful enough that it's going to carry itself. It's going to be tier 1, even with the consistency handicap that it has, because it has to include this many options and tamers. But you can see a lot of the numbers are a lot lower here. We got 12 to 14 rookies. If you play your cards right, you can still include a high number of rookies so that you can get the filter, but typically that means cutting a couple options and a couple tamers. So it makes your Shine Greymon less likely to be more powerful in the end. So again, it's the question of consistency versus power. But we have 7 to 9 level 5s and 4 to 6 level 6s. Now I put the level 7s on this list. Typically they won't play any. You have the option to play level 7s in the future with like Chaosmon, and you can put Omnimon and Ulforce. I don't like it, because your decks are designed to win based on getting these level 6s off with their tamer support. And I think the level 7s kind of hurt that, because you don't want to evolve on top of these bodies, but they're nice tech cards. Level 7s typically come with some form of removal, which, you know, could help against your weaker matchups. So that definitely could be a reason you choose to include level 7s in a deck like this. But typically, decks like this are already hurting on consistency enough that you don't really have the room for tech cards. And if they are tech cards, they better be tech cards that help you draw. So it's one of those things. But again, Shine Greymon is going to be a tier 1 deck, and it's a tamer-based deck. So if you want ratios for that, they're here on the screen right now. So I think I covered just about everything. Again, let me know what you guys thought of the video. Make sure you guys like, comment, and subscribe. Coming up on the channel, we're going to have a set 1.5 deck profile for a Gallantmon control-based deck that one of my subscribers asked for, and we're going to have gameplay video of the wall versus the Dimension Scissor control. So make sure you guys let us know what you want to see on the channel, because we're trying our best to get stuff out for you. So we'll see you in the next video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Bye, everyone.